Well, hello and welcome to the Psychopath School podcast number 8, How to Create Sustainable Change. Okay, so in the last podcast, obviously 7, we recapped essentially all the stuff we've been through so far with regarding existential philosophy and also obviously all the other stuff we've been through. So in this podcast, in this episode of the podcast, I want to look at, okay, so when you've been through that material and answered some of those questions and you start thinking about, I want to change something, how do you actually do it? And we've all experienced the scenario of, doing like a New Year's resolution or something like that. And a week into the new year, you can't even remember what the resolution is. So I want to look at like some of the frameworks and theories and what actually works in this situation. So the key question is, how can we create sustainable change, and especially in relation to a complex, uncertain environment? Because I'm sure you would agree that the last couple of years, so 2020, 2021, has been a very challenging environment to live in. Lots of different changes. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, and obviously creates a lot of stress. All right, so the key theoretical frameworks I want to go through. So just to quickly check back in on that existential framework and just have a look at some of the things that actually stop you from being able to, I suppose, break out or break free of that past-present loop. Then I want to look at complexity theory and what the implications are for decision making. So what is the effect of complexity or complex environment on us? We'll retouch some of the neurocognitive science material and how we make decisions, and again think about what the implications are. Have a look at systems thinking and the shifts that are required in that. And then I want to finish up looking at intentional change theory. So intentional change theory is a theory that's been around now for about, about 20 years. It's Richard Boyatzis, who works with Daniel Goleman, who's the emotional intelligence guy. And it's an interesting theory, and you probably note from the name of it, intentional change theory, that it relates to obviously being intentional from an existential perspective, and also moral intention theory, which I went through with regards to the ethics stuff. Also, you just want to highlight a little quote. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see it on the screen, but if you're listening to this, so the quote's from Kung Fu Panda 3, which is obviously a kids movie. Kids love to watch it. But some of the wisdom in those movies I think is great. So the quote is, if you only do what you can do, you'll never be more than you are. Okay, so if you only do what you can do, you'll never be more than you are. So I suppose the lesson in that is just to understand that there's benefit in trying to step out of your comfort zone. And sure, you can stay in your comfort zone, but if that's the case, then as it says there, you're never going to be more than you are. All right. So let's start off just revisiting the existential alignment model. And you probably recall from that those three I suppose, domains of existence: past, present, future. And when we went through this, I think this was in podcast 1, I think, we looked at I proposed to you, I suppose, the notion that most of us are cycling round and round and round the past, present loop. So we're basically pattern matching against what's going on. Sorry, pattern matching against the past and reacting to events as they occur. Which is fine as long as you're living in a stable linear environment. But as I just pointed out, we're not living in a stable linear environment. So some of that living in that way is going to cause you considerable frustration if you want to change something. And what I proposed was that most of us are only getting into the future present loop about sort of 5 to 10% of the time, and mostly only as a reaction to, or I suppose, dissatisfaction with what we're getting in the present moment. So we kind of G up our courage and do that. But it's worthwhile considering what actually holds us in that past present loop. So in other words, what stops us or prevents us from being able to change. And the key things that hold us in the past are baggage. So baggage from the past, so unresolved issues from the past that impact on our, I suppose, capacity to believe that things can be a different way. And then there's 4 key conversations. So it could be conversations with yourself, or it could be conversations with others. So these 4 key conversations will actually hold you in that past-present loop and prevent you from being able to create something different. So the 4 key conversations are, the first one is right-wrong type conversations. So if you think about 2 dogs in the park, fighting over a stick. So they each have hold of the stick and they're, fighting over it. Basically, it doesn't end until somebody's actually willing to let go. So think about the conversations you have with people where you're going into who's right, who's wrong, etc. And what happens is, in that type of conversation, people try and draw on past events and try and make it very logical and rational. But basically what happens is that traps you going round and round that loop, because you keep going back to the past. Well, you said this is what happened, here's the evidence, etc. But by definition, each time you're going back into the past. And you're fighting over something that has already happened and obviously can't change. The second type of conversation that can trap you in the past is the blame and judgment conversation. So again, if something happens, not happy with it, and you go straight into who's to blame and judgment, then again, that might give you comfort with what's happened in the past, because maybe it resolves you of blame, right? But it won't give you the opportunity to move forwards. The third conversation is us and them. So they do this and they do that. And again, that's going to trap you in the past because you're being directed by them again. And you might recall, I think it was in podcast 2, might have been 3, when I was talking about Jean-Paul Sartre. And Jean-Paul Sartre talking quite a lot about, the aim really from an existential perspective is to be free. And freedom in this sense is really about being free from them. So people who have some sort of control over your influence on your beliefs. And then the fourth conversation is the if only conversation, right? So if only, it goes like this. So if only I had more time, then I could do this, but I haven't, so I can't, right? If only I had more money, then I could do this, but I haven't, so I can't. So basically it's a conversation that, I suppose, short circuits your capacity or your ability to actually act on things, okay? So those 4 conversations, if you hear yourself engaging in those conversations, like internally, or if you hear yourself engaging in those conversations with somebody else, they're basically red flag conversations, okay? So when you hear that, ideally, if you want to change, what you should do is stop. Obviously, take a little deep breath, probably calm yourself down, because often those conversations are quite emotive. And then you need to pivot, right? So then you need to pivot over to the future. And so the key question to ask is, what do you actually want to create? Or what are you trying to create? The second question is, what would good actually look like? So see how we're going into the visioning stuff. And the third question is, why do you want it? All right. So that's the existential stuff. And I want to revisit this because this relates also to the neurocognitive science research as well, right? So just remember that. So with regard to change, from an existential perspective, the 4 conversations that are going to trap you in the past, right, wrong type conversations, blame and judgment, us and them, and if only. And if you're hearing those conversations, don't engage. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about complexity theory, because as I said, we are living in a complex environment. And it's important to think about complexity theory because it has implications for, really our well-being and our capacity to actually do things. And the framework I would just like to share with you is called the Cynefin framework, which is a weird word. It's a Welsh word. So Cynefin is Cynefin. And this is a framework that was put together by 2 researchers, Snowden and Boone, back in, I think it's about 2007. And basically what they say is that before you try and change anything or do anything of a strategic nature, you should first understand the nature of the environment that you're operating in, okay? Because your strategy for change is going to be different depending on the environment. And it basically, if you, what do you call it? So misidentify the environment and use the wrong strategy, again, you're going to be hitting your head against the brick wall, okay? So the 4 environments, or really it's 5 environments that they identify, are simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, or complete disorder, okay? And so let's forget about disorder for a sec. So let's focus on, there's a distinction between simple and complicated versus complex and chaotic. And the distinction is that the cause and effect relationship breaks down when you go into a complex or a chaotic environment, okay? So in a simple or a complicated environment, the cause and effect relationship is very stable. So you do A and you get B. Do A, get B. So you're very stable, very mechanical. So in a simple environment, so if you identify that you're in a simple environment and you want to change something, then what you should do is sense. This is what Snowden and Brett say. So you should sense what's going on, you should categorize, and you should respond basically by looking around for best practice. So who's doing best practice, and then effectively you retrofit it, okay? So if you wanted to do something like you're working in a, I don't know, mechanical type environment, engineering factory, something like that, and you want to have like, you identify that there's a few safety issues, right? So you analyze what's going on, you look around for who's doing best practice or what's best practice with regard to safety issues, and then you bring it into your organization, okay? Simple, logical, simple, basic, okay? If you are in a complicated environment, then what they say is you should sense, analyze, and then respond. So you see quite similar. So sense, analyze, and respond. And again, look around for what good practice is, and then again, retrofit it to your organization or your situation, maybe with a few tweaks. However, if you are in a complex or a chaotic environment, then as I said, the cause and effect relationship breaks down, right? So you do A, sometimes you get B, sometimes you get Z, F, G, Y, whatever, right? And in that environment, it can be very, very frustrating because you keep trying to fix something. So you keep trying to fix something thinking it's a simple or a complicated environment, right? But it doesn't work. Things keep changing. So you go, far out, what should I do in this situation? So what Snowden and Boone say is you should probe, right? So in other words, you probe the system. So you embrace the spirit of curiosity and go, I wonder what would happen if I do this. So you poke the beast, if you like. And then sense. So see what's actually happening. And what you're looking for is emergent practice. So something that's starting to grow, okay? Now note, it's important to note here. So see how you're looking for emergent practice. And so the question is, okay, so how do you know what you're looking for? How do you know what's emergent? How do you know if it's aligned to what you want? So obviously you need to do the visioning stuff first. So you need to work out what is it that you're actually trying to create. So see how that's crossing over into the existential stuff. And remember there with the visioning stuff, you're asking, okay, so what is it that I'm trying to create? What does good look like? What does that feel like? And why do you actually want it? Okay, so if you identify really clearly what it is you're trying to create, then when you're probing the system, so you're running these little experiments and probing the system, you're looking for anything that's emerging that is aligned to what you're trying to create. And if you find something, if you find something that's emerging, that's aligned to what you want to create, then you respond by embedding that as a practice. So if you go back to that past, present, future model, so remember with the past, present, future model, so in the future lives the vision. So it's aspirational being. So what you're trying to create. So it's your vision, your values, etc. Okay. And then remember, time is flowing from the future to the present to the past. So in the future, what you're trying to do is you're trying to plant seeds of possibility. Right? So plant seeds of possibility. Then in the present moment, you're trying to be as calm and present as possible So as you see that coming towards you, right? So see, we're looking for things that are growing, that are emergent, that are aligned to what we're trying to create. And if you see something that's coming towards you that is aligned, then you respond by embedding it in that past present loop, right, as a practice or a ritual or a process, right? So you go, wow, this is actually working. Okay, I'm going to embed that. And remember what you're trying to create here. You're trying to get the brain, I'll talk about the neuroscience stuff in a sec, but you're trying to get the brain to pattern match to what you want, in other words, what you want to create, as opposed to what you've always done. Because remember, we're going to default into pattern matching, okay? So complex environment, you're going to probe, sense, respond, and you're looking for emergent practice. A chaotic environment is even obviously more chaotic, okay? And what Snowden and Boone say is you should act, sense, and then respond. And what you're looking for is a novel event. So when it's chaotic, there's not much point probing. You may as well just act. So you act, far out, wonder what happens if I do this, act, sense, respond. Okay. So that's complexity theory. And you can do more reading and research on that if you want this Cynefin framework. Now, the challenging thing with regard to complexity theory is the effect that it has on us and the way we make decisions. So the next bit of theory I want to look at is neurocognitive science and obviously the way we make decisions. Now you might recall from previous podcasts that with regards to neurocognitive science, and so this is Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast, thinking slow. So basically we're making decisions using two interrelated processes. So there's a subconscious reflective pattern matching cycle, which is commonly referred to as systems 1 thinking. And there's a higher order reasoning cycle, which is systems 2 thinking. So the characteristics, so the majority of the time we're pattern matching, and the reason that we're pattern matching is because higher order conscious reasoning uses about 4 times as much energy as subconscious pattern matching, okay? So from a survival perspective, we're trying to save energy, so we default into pattern matching. And it's interesting, so the two systems have key characteristics. So systems 1, the key characteristic is you can't turn it off. So if I say to you, what's 2 plus 2, you can't stop 4 jumping into your head, right? You can't stop it, try it, you can't get it out of your head. And the key characteristics of systems 2 is that it's lazy. So it's like the lazy, I shouldn't say teenager, it's the lazy part of you that's lying on the couch wanting to watch TV, okay? So if you think about that, so every situation you go into, the systems 1, like you can't turn it off. So systems 1 is always looking for patterns. So you come into a situation, you're always looking for patterns. And basically the brain, as soon as the brain finds a pattern, then effectively it wants to set and forget. So it wants to pattern match, okay, yep, done, okay? Now, obviously, if that's what's happening, then you're going to have a lot of trouble changing because your brain is going to keep pattern matching against the past, and you're not going to be able to activate higher order conscious reasoning and actually change something, because remember, that's lazy. And you're basically going to create the same thing over and over again. And you probably find yourself feeling like quite frustrated because you're going, oh, far out, I keep doing this, I keep doing the same thing, it's stupid, why can't I change, blah, 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 blah. Well, the reason you can't change is because of the way that we're hardwired and the way your brain is going to, as I said, default into pattern matching. So when you're in a complex, uncertain environment, or when we are in a complex, uncertain environment, basically what happens is it has some pretty significant implications for the way we think, okay? So with regard to that systems 1, systems 2 thinking, it's often referred to, well, Daniel Kahneman also refers to it as like hot and cold decisions or hot and cold emotions. So when we're pattern matching, so pattern matching is very fast and we can do it with quite a lot of hot emotions. So we can't think through it, we emotionally respond. And in your brain, you've got a self-regulatory function which regulates between hot and cold decision making or fast and slow decisions, okay? Now, the interesting thing is, I suppose there's two interesting things about that. So the first thing is that our capacity for self-regulation, it doesn't instantaneously restore or replenish itself. So if you have a scenario in the morning, for example, where you get on the, I don't know, the train to go to work or uni or whatever, and on the train on the way there, some horrible person starts like having a go at you about whatever, right? Which you find quite stressful and quite threatening, and you have to use your self-regulatory function to stop yourself basically from exploding in anger and telling them to, F off, okay? So what will happen is you basically are depleting your self-regulatory function, right? So then if you then go into work or uni and something else happens, your capacity for self-regulation is diminished, and you're more likely to make a quick emotional hot decision, right? So in other words, pattern match and not actually think about it from a higher order conscious perspective. The second thing about it is that when you're in an environment of uncertainty, so by definition, in an environment of uncertainty, it's what would you call it? Kind of threatening your sort of normal way of doing things, and you're having to think more and create stress. And when you're stressed, then your ability to self-regulate becomes diminished. Okay. So the bottom line out of this. So the bottom line out of this is complex, uncertain environments create stress, inhibits the ability of our brain to accurately sort of predict or forecast the future, which again causes more stress. And then it diminishes our ability to self-regulate, and basically means that we're going to continue pattern matching, which in turn diminishes our capacity or our, I suppose, opportunity to be able to change. But there's more, okay? The way we're hardwired, right, so it means that we're going to continue to look for a simple solution. So that's the pattern matching stuff. Okay, so we keep thinking if it's worked before, we're going to assume it's going to work again. And as I said, you're going to default into that before you even have the opportunity to engage with higher order conscious reasoning. And we also suffer from confirmation bias. So remember confirmation bias? So when the brain's made a decision, so when the brain's decided things are a certain way, then the brain wants to be right. Even if, so do you remember this? Even if the decision that you've made is has negative or has negative implications for you, the brain still wants to be right. So once you've made a decision, we're going to suffer from confirmation bias, which basically means we're going to pay attention to all of the information, all of the evidence coming to us, which supports the decision we've already made, and we're going to dismiss any evidence that questions its validity. Right? So see how these sorts of things have momentum of their own. So basically, we roll along, and we basically get stuck in this around that past-present scenario, past-present loop, and then that inhibits our capacity for change. And then we have stress, and then when we have stress, then we go far out, what's wrong with me? And then see that drives you back. So we're into the right, wrong thinking, it drives you back into that loop, and then you start getting stuck, and then basically you start spiraling downwards, right? And remember what we're trying to do with the Sacred Path School is trying to walk a path of ascension. So we're trying to work out how do we actually spiral upwards, okay? So if you find yourself in that situation, it may be time to basically do a clearing, right? To actually stop and consciously choose to, I suppose, identify and release any anxiety, negative beliefs or experiences from the past, and actually purge them or get them out of your system. Draw a line in the sand and be able to move forwards. And hopefully what you're seeing as I'm going through this, you can start to see the benefit, hopefully, of why you should do things like mindfulness and meditation and stuff like that, right? Because the key thing with mindfulness and meditation is to enable you to be as present as possible, so that when you're faced with a situation in the present, you don't automatically pattern match to the past. because obviously as soon as you pattern match to the past, you're recreating that scenario and giving more momentum to that past present loop. So ideally what you do is you're as present as possible. Something happens, you're able to breathe and think about, okay, what action could I take that would be aligned to what I want to create rather than perpetuating what I've always done in the past. Should also note that if you cross over these two theories, so we're into interdisciplinary research. So if you cross over these two theories, the past-present loop will relate to systems one thinking, so in other words, pattern matching, and the future-present loop is going to relate to higher-order conscious reasoning. Okay, so the next bit is systems thinking. So we want to jump into systems thinking. So systems thinking is basically saying that when you're living in an environment that's uncertain and complex, there's a whole lot of things going on, right, in the system that is very hard to make sense out of, right? It's very hard to comprehend the whole system. So narrow linear type thinking where you're going in and trying to analyze events, again, isn't going to help you to be able to understand the system. And again, you're probably going to feel overwhelmed and stressed out, etc. And wonder what's going on, how do I get out of this scenario? And again, you're possibly going to be spiraling downwards from a well-being type perspective because you're going to have ongoing stress. So with regard to systems thinking, there's 8 key shifts to make. So the first shift is to release certainty and embrace curiosity. All right, so we want to find some way of being comfortable in uncertainty. Okay, comfortable in uncertainty. Remembering, again, that what the brain is going to do, what part of the brain is going to do, so left brain really, the brain wants to try and make sense out of it. And remember, curiosity is a superpower, right? So embracing curiosity is about embracing the question or the perspective of wonder. I wonder what would happen if this happened. I wonder what would happen in that scenario, okay? So being comfortable in uncertainty. The second shift to make is from disconnection to interconnectedness, okay? So disconnection to interconnectedness. Excuse me. So this is very much a mindset perspective. And if you think about disconnection, so if you think about analysis and that sort of stuff, basically you're trying to analyze things on their own, and again, that's disconnected. And what we're trying to think about is how are all these things connected together, right? Because we're trying to understand the whole system. The third shift is to shift from parts to wholes. So again, stop looking at the parts and look at the whole. The fourth shift is from linear to circular. So I've already talked a bit about that with regards to the neurocognitive science and also with regards to the existential stuff. So remember from the existential perspective and I suppose Socratic type philosophy. Socratic type philosophy, if you're faced with a problem in the present moment, the first thing you should do is look backwards. You should analyze the past, and basically what you're looking for is the root cause of the problem, right? So why did this happen? And then if you find the root cause of the problem, then you come up with a solution, and then you project that forwards. But you project it forwards in a very linear way. And it's predicated on your ability to accurately predict the future, okay? Which is obviously challenging in a complex, uncertain time, which is why you want to shift from linear type thinking to circular type thinking, right? So going round and round and round. And what you're trying to do, and sorry, this also relates to the Cynefin, the complexity framework. So remember in that complexity framework, if you're in a complex environment, they're saying you should probe the system, right? So I wonder what would happen if this happens. Then you should sense. So see how a bit of time passes and we come back around and go, okay, has anything shifted? And then if something shifted that is in line with what you want to create, in other words, it's emergent, then you should embed that, right, as a process. So see, we're going round and round and round. The fifth shift to do is from analysis to synthesis. And I always like the analogy that I like here is whether or not you think the world is a bicycle or a frog, okay? So So if you think the world is a bicycle, then you can pull it all apart into its bits, put it all back together, and it still works, okay? But if you think the world is a frog, you pull it all apart into its bits, right? Put it all back together, and of course it's not going to work. Unless we do some sort of, Frankenstein type thing, right? But basically it's not going to work, okay? So you see the distinction there from analysis to synthesis. So analysis, you're analysing all the bits. Synthesis, you're trying to work out how do these bits work together. So in other words, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? It's got this little element, je ne sais quoi, little thing in it that actually gives it that bit of life. And I would suggest to you, human beings and human experience is like that as well. The sixth shift is silos to emergence. Right, so understanding that larger things emerge from smaller parts. Right, so see how we're getting back to the idea of instead of doing big fixed solutions, you're doing all these small little habitual processes that allow something bigger to emerge. The seventh shift is from isolation to relationships. So this is quite similar. See how a lot of this stuff is quite similar because obviously we're looking at how it all crosses over. So to understand the system, instead of trying to analyse the system, right, what we want to look at is to look at the relationships between the parts in the system. So if you're thinking about yourself and about, how you can actually create sustainable change, then look at the relationships between the different areas of your life to try and understand the system. And remember as well that with regard to understanding the self, there's aspects of the self that are unknown to the self. And I like as well, there's a quote by Gurdjieff, I think it's the right way to pronounce his name. So basically what it says is that there are, what did he say? I think he says there are sort of things or philosophies basically that you're not going to understand until you ascend to a higher level of consciousness. Okay, so there are things that you're not going to understand until you ascend to a high level of consciousness, and that's why when you're doing this sort of stuff, you put together all the little building blocks, and then larger things emerge from those smaller parts. And then the eighth shift to make is from solutions to experimentation and play. So solutions type thinking is going to drive you down the path of going far out, what's wrong with me, how do I fix myself? So see how you're looking for a solution. But from an existential perspective and also a change perspective, systems thinking, all you're really looking for is movement, right? So you're looking for movement. So how do I move this forwards? And that's where the perspective of experimentation and play helps, because then you start asking questions like, I wonder what would happen if I do this, right? See how you're prodding the system, you're running an experiment. You see something that works, you embed it. Okay. And then the last little bit of theory I want to share with you is intentional change theory. Okay, so this is kind of, I would say, like an overall framework that ties a lot of this stuff together. So the key here is, I suppose, to remember, as I mentioned before, so this is the work of Richard Boyatzis. And as I said before, he works with Daniel Goleman, the emotional intelligence guy. This model, he's worked on this model, I think there's about 30 odd years of research around this, and basically playing around with MBA students and trying to work out what actually works with regard to change and what doesn't. And the model he's come up with, if you can see it on the screen, it's a circular model. If you can't see it, basically it's it goes round and round in circles, right? So no beginning, no ending, and what happens before affects what happens next. Okay, so it's an existential model, right? And what he says is that if you want to change something, then the first thing you should do, so like the existential stuff, is not look backwards, not go, what's wrong with me, analyse the past, etc. But you should take a little deep breath, and then you should turn the other way, and you should ask the question of who do I want to be, or what's my ideal self? And I would add to that the two further questions that you would ask from that, and I'll explain this in a sec, are what would that feel like? right? So one is what's my ideal self? The second one is what would it actually feel like? And the third question is why do you actually want that, right? So the reason why you want to know what would that actually feel like is because if you remember back to the past, present, future model, the existential stuff, then what holds you in the past is rational, logical thinking, right? So rational, logical thinking will hold you in the past. So very, very much, brain type stuff. So if you work out a rational, logical answer for why you want your ideal self, then you're basically competing against the same rational, logical thinking based on the past. But the rational, logical thinking based on the past has a lot of evidence, right? Has a lot of evidence based, again, obviously on the past. Rational, logical thinking based on the future and what you're trying to create will have no evidence or no direct evidence to say that you can actually do that. Right? So you have this internal conflict going on. So if you want to change, what you need to drill into is the emotional self, right? And what you're looking for is activation energy. So remember the neurocognitive science stuff. So systems one thinking, the characteristic of that is that it's can't turn it off. So remember 2 + 2, can't stop 4 jumping into your head. And the characteristic of higher order conscious reasoning, it's lazy, doesn't want to do anything, okay? So if you want to engage, and remember by definition, sorry, to go back to the existential stuff. So remember by definition, if you want to get into that future present loop, you need to engage higher order conscious reasoning and you need to engage will, right? Your will to actually step up to the plate and do something, even when you're like terrified to do it, right? Which means what you need is activation energy, right? And activation energy, as I mentioned to you, needs to be emotional energy. So when you ask that question of what do you actually want? So you say, what do you actually want? What are you trying to create? What does the ideal actually look like? So basically you go through that exercise until you get to 10 out of 10, until you're like, yeah, this is what I really want, right? Then your next question should be, what would that actually feel like? Right, so drill into the emotional self. What would that feel like? What's the emotion that would arise? And then the third question is, why do you actually want that? And with the why, I recommend, this is Simon Sinek's work, ask why 5 times. So why do you want that? Okay, because blah, blah, blah. Okay, why do you want that? And basically you're digging, and trying to stir up enough emotional energy to be able to activate the brain, the higher order conscious reasoning part of the brain, and get it into action. The next question you ask with regard to intentional change theory is, who am I now? Or what's my real self? And this is where you can use whatever tools you want to use to get a read on yourself. So you can ask for feedback from other people. Excuse me, you can do 360-degree reviews, Myers-Briggs, DISC, Herman Brain Instrument, anything like that. And what you're trying to uncover is the answer to 2 questions. So the first question is, what are your strengths? So where does your ideal and your real self overlap, right? So that's the, what am I doing right? What am I doing right? What am I doing right? Okay, so you got that. And then you want to ask, the second question is, okay, so what are my gaps? So where does my ideal and my real self differ? So where's the difference, okay? And if you think back to when we were talking about Jean-Paul Sartre, again, I think that was podcast 2 or 3, and Jean-Paul Sartre talked about, from an existential perspective, looking at my life as a project, right? So think about my life as a project. So you think about this, my life as a project and intentional change theory. So 1, what are you trying to create? 2, who are you now? So we want to know strengths and then gaps, okay? And then out of that, the key is you want to get into action, right? But remember that we're shifting away from solutions-based thinking and we're trying to get movement and experimentation, right? So when you've identified those 2 things, then your question to answer is, okay, so what's your learning agenda? So what's the experiment that you could actually run that would build on your strengths and reduce gaps? So basically you put together an experiment and you start actually playing around. So in other words, an experiment with some sort of hypothesis, time frame, measures, and then actually basically run it. And say, for example, you ran an experiment, over like 2 weeks or whatever. And at the end of 2 weeks, you look at the experiment. Your question is, okay, did the experiment work? And maybe the experiment was a complete disaster. Then the way to, I suppose, deal with that or rationalize that is, oh, well, that experiment didn't work. Let's try something else. But see how it doesn't go into, oh, I failed, I'm a failure, etc. It's just about the experiment. If the experiment did work and you got some good results in that, see how we're crossing back into the Cynefin framework. So if it worked, something emerged that was good, then you embed it as a ritual or process. So you embed it in that past present loop. And basically what you're trying to do from the perspective of intentional change theory is practice new behavior to build neural pathways through to mastery. So we practice it over and over and over again. So we basically change what the brain is going to pattern match against. But note how, you don't do it as one big solution. You do it as bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit, right? So see how big things emerge from little things. All the parts work together to create the whole. Boyartz says a few more things about intentional change theory, right? So I'll just take you through this because this is important as well. So the first one is that adults learn what they want to learn. And it's kind of like a duh. Well, of course they do. Yeah, of course they do. But how often do we actually take that into account? All sustainable change is intentional, right? So you have to think about, like, all the time, the key question to ask is, what is your intention? So what are you trying to create? The potency of the desired end state is driven by the emotional components of the brain. See what I was saying before about why it's so important to dig into, like, what does it feel like? Why do you want it? Why do you want it? Why do you want it, right? So we're trying to stir up the emotions so that the potency of the end state, the desired end state, is high. So you go, oh, I really, really want that, right? So you're really driven to do something about it. Hope is the emotional driver, right? And it's also worthwhile to be aware of the fact that the change process is often non-linear and discontinuous. So in other words, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Stop, start, etc., etc. And that's really important to understand, because if you know that when you're trying to change something, you're going to have setbacks and it's going to be like that, then when a setback occurs, you're going to deal with it much better than if you think that, oh, it's all just going to happen really easily. Okay? The change process must begin with the person wanting to change. Okay, so this is one of these things, right? But this is also why it's critically important to ask the why question. Okay, why? And it's also why as well, probably many of you have been through the situation where, a friend is having some issue or something and you're saying to them, oh, you should do this or you should do that, telling them what they need to change, but part of them actually doesn't want to change and nothing actually ever changes, okay? So you've got to want to change. Sustainable change requires emotional freedom, right? So it needs to have emotional freedom because, by definition, so remember that change only occurs at the optimal point of discomfort, right? So change only occurs at the optimal point of discomfort. So you need to feel uncomfortable to be able to change. Because by definition, if you're comfortable, you go, it's okay, yeah, whatever, right? But if you're going to change and you're going to feel uncomfortable, in that state of feeling uncomfortable, you need to be able to experiment, right? You need to be able to go, I wonder what would happen if I try this. You need to have the, I suppose, emotional stability to be able to experiment. And hence you need emotional freedom. And importantly, you need to feel psychologically safe. Right? And I would say not only psychologically safe, I'd say emotionally, physically, materially, and spiritually safe. Right? If you don't feel safe, if you feel threatened, then you're much more likely to go into survival mode. Right? And then, of course, your self-regulatory function is diminished. Your capacity to step out of your safe zone is going to be diminished. And by definition, you're going to circle round and round and round the past-present loop. And basically, you're going to mark out your territory and defend your territory with right-wrong type thinking. The last point to make there is that behavioural change takes 6 to 12 months. Okay, so that the what do you call it? Anecdote, I suppose it is, that many of us have been told is, it takes 30 days to effect a change. Yeah, research kind of going, no, not really. Right? Maybe with some small things, and maybe with all the things on your side. But if you're talking about making major behavioural change, it's really a 6 to 12-month commitment. So again, if you're aware that you need to commit to 12 months, you need to be structured about it, then it takes a lot of the stress out of it, even when there's setbacks and nothing's happening. If you're not aware of that, then you may quit. You might have your first setback after a month. You think this is never going to work, and you quit. Okay, and I would suggest to you that the number one reason why people fail is because they quit too soon. Right, so they give up too soon. And again, if you know that 6 to 12 months is a commitment, and you put in place some of the structures that I've talked about, then obviously you can do some stuff about it. The other thing to be aware of with the Boyatzis intentional change model is that the circle in the middle of that model, the key circle or oval, is that you need to develop trusting relationships that help support and encourage each step in the process. So in other words, help support and encourage you each step in the process. And again, the reason why you need to do that is because, by definition, stepping out of your comfort zone, more stress, more failures, more setbacks. So when you're actually going through a situation where you're having a setback, you need to be able to pick up the phone or call on somebody to give you some help. So I want to end this podcast with 2 little exercises for you to do. So the first exercise is to ask the question of who's in your circle, right? So in other words, who's in that circle of trusting relationships to help support and encourage you. And I'd say to you, ideally identify 4 or 5 people that are in that circle. And they might be, they should have like different characteristics, okay? So there might be somebody in that circle who's really good at giving you a swift kick up the you-know-what when you need a bit of motivation. You might have someone in there who's kind of like a bit of a shoulder to cry on. You might have someone in there who's a mentor type figure, etc. Okay, but the key in it is to explicitly identify who those people are, to ask the question of what do they bring to the table, right? So what are you actually asking of them? And the third question is, how do you enroll them? So how are you explicitly going to enroll those people in your project? And by project, I mean your life as a project, right? So that's the first exercise. So think about, far out, like, who do I really count on in tough times? Like, what do they bring to the table? How do I get them on side? And it can be as simple as saying to people, look, I'm trying to change, blah, 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 blah. I really appreciate the support you give me in this way. And would it be okay if from time to time I call you for some help? Okay. So then the second exercise to do is to ask the question of what's your experiment? All right. So what's your experiment? So see how we want to get on the experimental path here. And I'm hoping that by now, going through this podcast, you've identified some of those key questions around, who you believe you are, what your vision is, what your values are, etc. Hopefully you're doing daily practice. Hopefully you're doing weekly feedback loops. And now we want to start trying to experiment and play around with things. So the process is to go through these 7 questions. So the first one is, what do you want to change? The second one is, why do you want to change it? So that's the times 5. So why? The third one that I mentioned before is, what would the ideal look like? And what would the ideal feel like? The fourth question is, what's your leverage point? And it's interestingly enough, in a lot of these situations, the leverage point isn't going to be what you think it is. So for example, we know that, like I've explained to you, I think in the past, with regard to breathing, so different emotional states relate to different styles or methods of breathing, but it also works around the other way, right? So in other words, by changing the way you breathe, you can change your emotional state. We also know that with regard to things like depression, anxiety, stuff like that, one of the key leverage points can be physical exercise. So what I'm asking you is to identify what the leverage point is with regard to this change experiment, and obviously to make sure that you work on that leverage point. Now, the fifth question is, whose help do you need? So that's the who's in your circle. The sixth one is to actually design your experiment. And then the seventh question is, how will you measure success, right? Because you need to know. So the question is, how will you know you're actually succeeding? So what is the success measure? All right, so that's about it for this podcast. So hopefully that's been useful for you. Again, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts and you want to see the video with the slides, you can look at the Sacred Path School YouTube channel. You can go to LinkedIn and connect with the Sacred Path School on LinkedIn. And you can also go to Facebook and connect with the Sacred Path School on Facebook. All right, bye for now. I hope that's been useful to you.